Up next, an up-close look at Fleetwood Mac with questions from the AOL audience.
Hi, we're Fleetwood Mac, and you're watching Sessions at AOL.
Fleetwood Mac are widely acknowledged to be among the greatest rock bands of all time. Over a span of 25-plus years, Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, Christine McVie, Stevie Nicks, and Lindsey Buckingham created a string of ubiquitous singles and spawned Rumors, their 1977 masterpiece, which documented the fraying relationships within the band and gave the world one of the biggest selling albums ever. They recently joined us to talk about their latest project, Say You Will. It's the first collection of new songs from the core members in almost 15 years. John McVie wanted us to point out that he was suffering from laryngitis on the day of our shoot, and that's why he was keeping silent. AOL member Rumors277 asked how the band's latest album project came to be.
This has been kind of an epic effort, you know. Maybe 6 years ago, I was starting a solo record, and Mick and I went in the studio and cut a bunch of tracks with Rob Cavallo, and so that project got shelved. When we got off that, I kept working on it, and in the meantime, Stevie put out an album and was on the road. When I was ready to release the solo material, things were not very good over at Warner Brothers. All the people over there were ready to leave, and it just was a kind of a lame duck situation. It wasn't really a good time to be risking putting out an album. So Mick and I thought, well, let's work on trying to make it into a Fleetwood Mac album.
Noticeably absent is Christine McVie. Drummer Mick Fleetwood explains why she chose to sit this one out.
Chris made it fairly clear she wasn't really enjoying the whole touring thing and traveling. Certainly didn't like flying very much. And then when we came off that tour, we had all had sort of overview thoughts of doing an album, and she sort of slowly sort of pulled out of the situation pretty much completely. And once we'd all convened to do this, it just was not on the cards that she was up for doing what's involved in doing this. It's a huge commitment.
AOL member Steve and Cheryl wanted to know how Christine's absence affected the band's dynamic.
That became a catalyst in itself for how four of us are sitting here, and more importantly, the process and the body of work we just completed with Say You Will. That really pushed a lot of buttons creatively in terms of, I mean, the obvious one for me is seeing these two people here in front of me and John. That whole dynamic is a fascinating one, because they came into Fleetwood Mac together, and sort of in many ways this is sort of a full circle, seeing that element really play out something almost that I never got to see, you know, because they joined Fleetwood Mac.
We had to wait 25 years to do what we really wanted to do.
So I think the fact that Christine is not with us really spurred a lot of creative things that we sort of rose to, in terms of some sort of somewhat predictable, but a lot really not predictable at all, in terms of how this album morphed its way together, you know, in her absence. You know.
Cowgirl Al wanted to know how Stevie felt about being the only woman in the band.
Well, it's different. I mean, since 1975, it was me and Chris, so it's very different. For me, as a woman, I really miss my friend. But I also, you know, let her go with love, and told her that she had to go do what she wanted and needed to do for herself, because we all love her that much that we just had to release her.
AOL member Tony W321 wanted to know if Mick and John had been doing any blues recordings in recent years, given that the original Fleetwood Mac lineup was an offshoot of John Mayall's Blues Breakers.
In years gone by, I have absolutely played with a very fine blues guitar player called Ron Thompson in a band that for the most part was called the Blue Whale, you know, now called the Big Mojo. It's whatever it's fancy, but I've enjoyed doing that. In fact, I was in Hawaii recently on holiday and had a good play with John Mayall, who was both John's old boss and my old boss, John Mayall from John Mayall's Blues Breakers. It's fun. It's part of life, and one day probably find me in some restaurant playing in Hawaii. You know.
Fleetwood Mac. Look for their long-awaited new release, Say You Will, from Reprise Records. If you'd like to see and hear more interviews, great live performances of all styles, check out AOL Keyword Sessions.
We make all of our sons the same. Everyone will suffer the fire.
Goodbye.
Have a nice day now.
We're made for this kind of stuff, you know?